Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a totally fascinating mystery that bridges ancient mythology and actual hard biology. You know, most of the time, when we think of mythical creatures, we just assume they were spun purely out of human imagination. But sometimes, if you dig deep enough into the historical and scientific records, you find a biological reality that is honestly just as incredible as the legend itself. Today, we're uncovering the true phoenix.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty details, I want you to really think about this question. Where did the legend of the immortal phoenix actually come from? I mean, think about the universally recognized pop culture bird of fire. We've all seen it in movies, read about it in fantasy novels, we see it as a mascot for sports teams. It's that majestic, flaming eagle that bursts into ashes only to be reborn. It's an incredibly iconic image, right? Well, prepare to have your assumptions completely challenged, because its true origins will definitely surprise you.
All right, let's start with our baseline. The Greek historian Herodotus, who was writing way back in the 5th century BC, is essentially the guy who introduced the phoenix to the Western world. He described this magnificent red and gold eagle-like bird that was intimately connected to the sun. Now, according to Herodotus, this bird had a wildly dramatic 500-year life cycle. At the very end of its life, it would build a funerary egg out of myrrh to transport its predecessor's corpse to the temple of the sun. This right here is basically the foundation of the phoenix myth as we know it today.
Let's move into part 1, the original phoenix, entering ancient Egypt.
To find the real roots of this myth, we actually have to travel much further back in time to meet a powerful deity named Bennu. Now, to the ancient Egyptians, Bennu wasn't just some magical bird. He was a fundamental piece of the universe's architecture. He was said to be the Ba, which, for context, we can understand as the personality component, or the animated soul, of the supreme sun deity, Ra. Through this incredibly strong connection, Bennu was the active force that enabled the creative actions of another major god, Atum. So he is right there at the absolute very start of Egyptian theology.
Picture this scene because it is incredibly atmospheric. According to the myth, before the world as we know it even existed, there was only this vast, dark, unformed watery abyss known as none. Bennu flew completely alone over these silent, still waters. Eventually, he landed on the very first primeval rock to emerge from the depths. And then, he shattered the absolute silence. He issued a single resounding call that actually determined the very nature of creation itself. His voice literally sparked the universe into existence.
Now, these creation actions build perfectly into the phoenix legend we recognize today. Bennu's titles heavily revolved around this idea of periodic renewal and shining brilliance. For instance, he was called He Who Came into Being by Himself, which really emphasizes his role as a self-created creator god. He was also the Lord of Jubilees, which is a clear nod to the cyclical renewal of the sun. Actually, even his name is tied to the Egyptian verb uben, which means to rise in brilliance or to shine. And as you'd probably expect, because he was the ultimate symbol of rebirth, he naturally became closely tied to Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection.
Which brings us to part 2, the art shift, from songbird to giant.
So when we look at how the Egyptians actually translated this creator god into their artwork over the centuries, we see this fascinating visual evolution. If you look at the Old Kingdom texts, the original Bennu wasn't a grand eagle or a massive beast at all. He was depicted as a tiny, shrieking water bird. Scholars actually believe it was likely modeled on a yellow wagtail or a Mediterranean kingfisher. And honestly, that makes perfect sense if you imagine a small bird darting over the water and breaking the silence with a sharp cry. But by the time we reach the New Kingdom, the art completely transforms. Bennu was suddenly depicted as a massive, imposing gray heron with a long beak and the sweeping two-feathered crest, often wearing the Atef crown of Osiris and perched on a willow tree or a sacred stone.
This takes us to part 3, a human-sized inspiration. This is where paleontology meets mythology.
So, you're probably wondering, why the sudden shift to a giant heron in the artwork? Well, right around 1500 BC, a completely real, giant, human-sized heron finally went extinct on the Arabian Peninsula. Just let that sink in for a second. An actual bird, roughly the size of a fully grown person, was walking the earth around the exact same region during the era of ancient Egypt.
And the crazy thing here is that this New Kingdom depiction wasn't just a fantasy drawn out of thin air. Back in 1977, in the United Arab Emirates, scientists actually discovered the remains of this giant prehistoric heron.
And because it shared so many physical characteristics with the New Kingdom artwork of the deity, scientists genuinely believe this very real, prehistoric monster bird was the actual animal model for the god. It was such a perfect fit that archaeologist Dr. Ella Hawk officially named the species Ardea bennuades, literally the Bennu heron.
All right, part 4, from Bennu to Phoenix, merging myth and reality.
With this shocking biological reality in our back pocket, let's connect the dots back to the Greek phoenix we all know. Remember Herodotus from the very beginning of this explainer? When he was writing down his account of the phoenix, he specifically noted that he heard the legend from the people at a place called Heliopolis. Now, Heliopolis was the major ancient Egyptian cult center dedicated exclusively to the sun gods Atum, Ra, and, yep, you guessed it, Bennu. Herodotus was quite literally talking to the priests of Bennu. If we compare these two traditions side by side, it's honestly like watching a historical game of telephone in action. You can clearly see the DNA of the myth. Both are deeply, deeply tied to the sun and to rebirth. But you can also see how the Greek tradition morphed the visual from a giant gray heron into an eagle with red and gold plumage, probably to better match their own aesthetic of the sun. The Greeks also took the abstract concept of Bennu's cyclical renewal, that whole Lord of Jubilees thing, and codified it into a strict 500-year life cycle ending with a dramatic funerary egg of myrrh. But hold on, there is one massive difference we have to highlight here. It is absolutely vital to note that unlike the Greek phoenix, which is of course famous for dying in a fiery pyre and rising from its own ashes, the ancient Egyptian texts never, not once, mention Bennu actually dying. To the Egyptians, he was a constant, eternal force of creation. That whole dramatic death and resurrection by fire, that was a later addition, most likely a Greek misunderstanding, or maybe just an embellishment, of the Egyptian concept of daily solar renewal.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really think this completely changes how we look at our own stories. The original phoenix didn't rise from literal ashes, but rather, its legend rose from the bones of a giant extinct heron, an animal that literally disappeared from the earth 3,500 years ago, but whose ghost still flies through our imaginations and pop culture today. It makes you wonder, what other mythical creatures are just the echoes of prehistoric beasts we've completely forgotten about? Keep that in mind, and always question the origins of the myths you think you know. Thanks for joining me.